So with two of South Africa's biggest artists being Casper Nyovest and Kabza coming out to show a little bit of support towards the subject matter of faith within the branch of St. John, or the branch of the faiths of St. John. If you don't know the church, it's called the St. John Church of Prophecy. I don't know what the exact same full name is. I do know that this particular church was started by a lady called Manku, and I watched a couple of their clips, and they kind of like border around the subject matter of church being empowerment, like her being a church leader was a way of viewing subject matters of empowerment.
And also lead the prophet tsa di sileng. First of all, ke rata ho hlalosa hore from lelapeng la hae una emphasize gender equality. Le mo kerekeng una emphasize gender equality. Bomme ba na le di role tsa bona. Tse ding di tshwana le tsa bontate, tse ding ke tse affectang bomme fela.
I wanted us to have a conversation about it, but not fully about this particular subject. I actually came to this thought after I saw that Casper Nyovest is having an album coming out. If you don't know Casper Nyovest, he is a hip-hop musician who is an extremely successful hip-hop musician in South Africa particularly. Now, his latest album, I think, is coming out in September or something like that. He recently announced it. And so there was an article when I was browsing on Facebook, boom, it came up from the Sowetan, I think. And they were saying that his album is coming out very recently. Now, the picture that's in there, it's him in like a look of this church. He's dressed like people that would go to this church. And so that piqued my interest in the subject. But when I said Kabza the Small, you might be wondering, what is it that hinted for you that Kabza the Small might also be from that church? It's that some time ago there was this picture that came up where you could see him wearing the church uniform for the man while standing to an elderly lady who seems to be a member, fully clothed in the church regalia, right? And so now this kind of like picks back at some of the things that we've seen Kabza the Small display. We know that he is a guy who carries ispandla. Is that what they call ispandla? The thingy, the animal skin on the thingy. Now for those that don't know, the animal skin, it's for those that don't know, I mean people outside the country. The animal skin is mostly worn by people who have had to acknowledge, not necessarily that they have an ancestral spirit, but that they had to acknowledge at one point of their life, they had to acknowledge the ancestral side of their life, which means there was an animal that was killed, and after that, the skin of that animal that was killed was the one that actually they ended up wearing. So when you see a person wearing ispandla, it's because there was a ritual of an animal that died, and then they were given that particular thing. Now, this piqued my interest also looking at the fact that these are two of the largest artists in South Africa. Kabza the Small does amapiano. He's very popular in amapiano. He's one of the biggest in amapiano, if not the most popular in amapiano, right? He had an album called Kings and Scorpions, and that album was with him and Mapurisa, right? And then that particular album kind of propelled his thing. Not necessarily that, but all of the other work that he has done. He's a very talented young man, right? Now, that's what piqued my interest, particularly in digging into the side of thingy. Because if you think of Casper Nyovest's cover on that picture, I don't know if this is going to be the cover of a song or a cover of an album. He's standing in front of the sign of the church, and that particular sign of the church being the Church of St. John, with the emblem and all that entire jazz, with the little thingy that he's wearing over there. And so you have that. Even in the caption on the Instagram post, I don't know if it's the Instagram post, I saw it on the article, it does show that the location where he shot it, it's somewhere in one of the branches. So my interest in this particular subject was two of the biggest artists are promoting this church. one of them hasn't acknowledged his ancestral side of had an animal killed for acknowledging or to acknowledge the ancestral side of his life. Now, we are very clear on this particular subject of ancestors. It is not something that God tells us to do. He says, do not communicate or establish communication with those that have passed. But in our African beliefs, that's what they do. So if he's part of a church and he has gone through that route, or maybe it might be because probably one of the family sides, either his father's side or his mother's side, does the ritual, those particular ritual thingy. But then the question is, what does he himself believe? It's just a question we are asking. So these two displaying it really didn't focus my mind around their faith, because we know they're kind of like worldly musicians, right? What piqued my interest was, what is the doctrine of this church that they would be willing to propagate its image or its ideals out there? That kind of became my interest in this particular thing. So I had these questions in my head to say, what does this church teach? Now, when we look a little bit in, I might have to actually go back in and look at the doctrines like as a whole. At the moment, I've just noticed, first of all, Nanko being a lady that was head of this church, in kind of like the biography thing that they did with the SABC, they kind of just look at her as being in that position was kind of like women empowerment. And I've always said, that's not how we look at doctrine. Church position or church leadership is not empowerment. We don't do that. It's a calling position. Okay? And so that was a bit off. But if you notice, point number 2, this church does hang a lot in music. It kind of propels the idea of music a lot. So I don't know if these two guys, it's just a subject matter of saying, they were born in this church, or their parents used to go to those churches when they were over there. So it kind of piqued my interest in that lane to say, maybe it's just a subject matter of I was born in this church, and so that's the church I can acknowledge, right? That might be just that, but it does pique the interest of what is the doctrine of that church particularly. So number one thing that I've noted, that the church does draw that idea of, they don't sound like they're very big on doctrine. And I've stated, doctrine is the center of the church. When a church has a doctrine that is lacking in certain areas, it can kind of pick out on certain things. Now, if you're hearing a person coughing, my apologies. It's someone who's smoking. Okay? So, apologies over there. Now, point number 2, apart from the subject matter of them with this idea that they don't really put doctrine like properly face, one of the things that I heard them mention was that she used to advocate for the use of salts and the use of water and the use of all these things. But in that documentary, the SABC documentary that I'm talking about, they didn't really emphasize on what the doctrine of the church as a whole is. Teaching, not practices. When the doctrine of the church is literally the practices, not teaching, it goes off a little bit, for me it goes a little bit in my first thought, because if it's all practice, it can get very carnal and it can stray people into the wrong direction, just on the fly, right? I haven't studied the church that much. But secondly, another thing that I noted is that her grave is very much covered up like the Catholic saints. So if you see where they have her grave, it's like covered up like TB Joshua. It's kind of like the same. It's like a room, and that they've done that. Now that elevates subject matters of idol worship. Catholic churches do that a lot. They see their leaders or those that have passed away as saints. Creates problems when you do those kind of things. And so her grave is being entombed in that format. They've entombed it into, they've put it into like a room section or thingy. And so, yeah, raises red flags right there already. So, and also when I heard her praying, there's a video that I saw of her praying. Their prayers sound very Catholic. prayers sound very, very Catholic. And they have this thing that they do with incense and stuff like that they just so I had a lot of questions when I saw this particular videos that I'm talking about right now. It kind of it made me ask the questions, what exactly does this church teach? Maybe one of you guys know it or whatnot. I don't know it, but already on the things that I've noted, and they are very big on music, as I've stated. And churches that are mostly big on music, they tend not to focus on doctrine, and when they don't focus on doctrine, a lot of errors gets implemented because it's just all practice without teaching. The teaching, it's where the errors come up because people just love the music, but they have never listened to the teaching. And so, y'all tell me what you know about this particular church. If you understand it, what do they teach, where, how? Y'all know where to find me on the WhatsApp number of the Church Reality Check. I'm very much interested in understanding the rest of the things that I am not seeing here. For me, experiences can differ, but doctrine says a lot. And so if a person can tell me their experience, it might be just like, maybe it's their experience, but the doctrine tells you a lot. I haven't seen anything doctrinally, and I know churches that focus a lot on music, doctrinally they're way off. But y'all tell me what you think. It's Ricky's Reality Show with daily Christian commentary videos. I just thought to ask this question once I saw that two of the biggest South African artists are actually promoting this church. Interesting.